Good morning and welcome to House Transportation here on Friday, the last day of January 2025. And we have my apologies for our hard start to get going after the floor. Everybody runs into somebody to talk to on the way up, myself included, although I think I ran up and so I didn't have that trouble today. But we have Andrea Wright and Patrick Murphy both with us today. So I'm not sure which one of you is starting, and we'll hand it over to whichever one of you want to jump up and go first. We're getting an update on our NEVI program and chargers in general. So fire away.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, I'm here and I will be here to answer questions, but Patrick is going to carry the conversation. As you all know, or most of you know for sure, that Patrick, what used to be in the Environmental Policy and Sustainability Group, which I lead, and now has taken on a new role, but really started both the EV incentive programs and carried those through, as well as the charging. So he will lead the presentation and I will be here to help answer questions should that be needed, but mostly Patrick's testimony today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. For the record, Patrick Murphy, State Policy Director with the Agency of Transportation. Happy to be here. So I understand you have some more testimony at 10:30, so this will be a very quick overview. Some of the slides we'll run through more quickly than others, but feel free to ask questions or follow up after the presentation.
You know, as Patrick's pulling that up, I will just reference this discussion today to the report that we provided on the 15th, giving a summary of where we're at in meeting the state goals and as well as the climate action plan targets.
Can you see this presentation okay now?
Yep.
Yes.
Great. Okay. So as I've said before in prior presentations, much of this work comes to us through the Global Warming Solutions Act, which established requirements for emissions reductions at different points over time. And then as 40% roughly of state emissions, transportation accounts for that amount, we expect to also reduce our emissions by in proportion to that 40%. So we've got modeling that's been done for the Comprehensive Energy Plan as well as the Climate Action Plan. And there are strategies that are identified in the latter to be working away at vehicle electrification, which holds the most promise for obtaining those greenhouse gas emissions reductions in the shortest period of time. EV charging investment is a critical piece to that. So not only do we need to kind of bring down the cost of vehicles, which is the #1 concern among Vermonters, but a close second is having the EV charging infrastructure to support that purchase, to be able to give people the confidence they need to get around to where they need to go, particularly on longer trips. So last year, you all updated the goals, or those of you who are in the legislature updated the goals for fast charging along our interstates and state highway network. Previously, it was 1 mile from every exit was the state's target, and within 50 miles of the next charging location. These goals mirrored the requirements of the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, which is the NEVI program that we'll talk about today. And so this just updates those aspirations to go beyond that in terms of moving beyond 50 miles as the distance and getting deeper into places so that people could really be within 15 miles, say, if no more than 15 miles away from the nearest charger. And 3 driving miles was updated to reflect the the realities in Vermont where the best place for charging might not be right off the highway. There might not be any place to charge right off the highway. It might be a green site. There might not be the amenities that people would want to feel safe and have a convenient experience. So that led into the third goal being added, that there were these amenities in proximity for people to be able to walk to and be able to enjoy while they're charging, because charging is albeit something that's getting faster and faster as technology progresses. It's still not the same as a gas filling experience, particularly for the longer distance travel when you need more of a fast charge. Most of the time people are charging at home. 80 to 90% of charging takes place at home. And so there's no real time commitment there. You're charging at night or when you're out and about, but there are times when people need to travel longer distances and rely on this fast charging network, and that's where you need to kind of have added convenience while you charge. This is just shared for a reference. I won't go into it unless people have specific questions about it, but it's to frame the discussion around what are we actually talking about when we mean fast charging today. And this gives you a sense of the amount of time it takes to charge a vehicle, the average vehicle. And again, battery technology is changing, and we may see charts like this change in the very near future. But what we're focused on here is the fast charging along the highway network. And we're deploying no less than 150 kilowatt stations, which is sort of the higher end of fast charging. This frames up sort of the charging ecosystem and how pieces serve different purposes. So fast charging is needed when you're making longer trips, but the majority of charging will take place at home. If you don't have home access or access to home charging, it can be at the workplace that you find, you have a longer time to be able to charge up at a level 2 charger, or it might be when you're out shopping and trying to get errands done, that you're able to use a level 2 or even a level 3, a fast charger. So there are different ways that these work together, and they're all important because if there's not a significant amount of access to home charging, then it relies more upon fast charging, and fast charging is more expensive, both to invest in, to build out, but also for the consumer to be able to pay for that. On a per kilowatt hour basis, is sometimes more than double what you might pay at home. So that's important for considerations of equity in the transition to electric vehicles. This is, again, for references, to give you an idea of how much each kind of or type of charging costs for building it out, installing it, and then again here for how much it might cost on an annual basis to maintain. The state's done a lot of work within the EV charging space since 2014, over 10 years. The Agency of Commerce and Community Development has been the lead with just starting off with a small amount of funds at that point that were going to municipalities and other community attractions. That has deeply increased in the last couple of years, and it's specifically increased because of the amount of federal funding that has been available through the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, but then also through some of the charging fueling infrastructure grants, things that are coming out of both the bipartisan infrastructure law in 2021, and then the following year, the Inflation Reduction Act, which also had renewed tax credits for charging infrastructure projects. So National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program followed a number of years in which FHWA, the Federal Highways Administration, had a designation process for alternative fuel corridors. And alternative fuels refers to a number of different things, hydrogen, electric. But in the case of Vermont, it's really just referring to EV infrastructure. We have, even though you see there's a little distinction there in the light green versus darker green, there were two designations: corridor ready, which are the interstates 89, 91, and state routes 9, 2, and 7. And then the corridor pending, there were some segments of 2 and 7 that fell into that. And then they, parts of 91 as well. So there's, it's just important to note that the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, NEVI, was only able to fund stations on these designated corridors. There's some more flexibility with other funds. We'll get to that in just a few minutes, but we were only able to kind of build out along these corridors. And as I mentioned before, there were a number of rules that came with it. You had to build out, in order to get the full build out for the state, you had to have stations within 50 miles of one another, and they had to be within 1 mile of an exit. And you had to have a minimum of 4 stations so that we didn't come across the sort of instance that sometimes people do now, where there's only 1 or 2 chargers, and if those are being used, it's not really a useful network to a number of people. So there were some minimum standards that were established through this. The federal government took a long while to be able to actually finalize those rules, and it did, because all of this is new, make things time-consuming in terms of contracting. And so we went through a number of different processes to be able to get approval with our process, which was to identify through an RFQ process a list of qualified providers who would be able to help us in building this infrastructure out. It is a different paradigm here that we're working with, where the agency is contracting with private vendors to then reach site host agreements with potentially another party, private party, to then build out stations that will be owned by those by that private vendor and maintained as well. And we're really just making sure that through our contracts, that happens in the way that is consistent with the federal guidelines, and that the investments we're making will live long into the future. And I can't really see, you're all little tiny people on my screen, so if you do have questions, just shout them out, please. This gives you an idea of the factors that went into our initial map. So the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program required a plan first to be approved by FHWA before we were able to access that year's funding. So we've gone through and submitted and had approved 3 annual plans over the past 3 years. And the initial mapping out of where we would need to build to most cost effectively get to fully built out status, these were the factors that went into that mapping analysis. And the biggest driving factor here is really the guidelines themselves, making sure that the stations were no more than 50 miles apart and that they were close to the interstate or state highway network, and that there were some other concerns that looked at gaps in charging availability? Where would it be more likely that folks without access to home charging but need to rely more on public charging? And then further along in our processes, when we actually received bids over the summer, we were looking at what are the best sites for these projects? What are the amenities around there? What do we think will be successful for the long term? So we did, in the spring of last year, we were just the sixth state to be able to open a NEVI-funded station or location. There are 4 fast chargers, 180 kilowatt fast chargers there, in addition to 2 50 kilowatt stations that the Agency of Commerce and Community Development had installed in a level 2 station. So it's quite a bit of charging for that area. That began that was a foundation that we built on for our subsequent solicitations. So we built a list of 8 qualified providers in the spring into the summer of this past year. And from that list, we chose projects in another solicitation for the 14 locations that had not been built out. We awarded 11 additional locations, and we're under contract for 6 at the moment. And we had plans to early next week release a second solicitation to get more funding out. We were in this first round, it was roughly $8 to $9 million that we were able to award for 62 ports. So we found that we were getting more than we had projected, in part because the Inflation Reduction Act allowed for some of the vendors to put more of the money towards these projects than might have happened otherwise. So these are funded at an 80-20 split, 80% federal funds, NEVI funds, 20% coming from the private sector. This is also a sort of unique aspect to these. In other highway projects, you might have, some funding split that involves the state, maybe some from the local governments, but not usually, all of the local match being provided by the private sector.
Patrick, we do have a question from.
Sure.
Yeah.
Welcome back.
Thank you, Patrick. So just to clarify, the previous, that map. So the green locations are locations that currently have level 3 chargers, and the blue are identifying potential future locations. Is that correct?
No, thank you for that question. Because given the time we have, I glossed over that point. So in our second NEVI plan, we had also identified locations where we could have higher powered charging and a higher number of chargers. These are in places that you see here in the blue, where they might also support the beginnings of electric freight travel. So St. Johnsbury, Berlin, White River Junction, South Burlington, Rutland, those were all places, Brattleboro, where we had expected to be able to deploy more than the minimum, more than the 4 chargers, potentially up to the 8 chargers, and do so at a higher power that would support larger battery sizes that could receive that. So we had a number of grant applications that we applied for additional funds to be able to deploy in those locations that weren't successful. But it is still the plan to be able to go beyond that minimum amount of charging and get be able to plan for greater redundancy within the network, but then also go to that early sort of electric freight travel that might be a possibility. So also looking at pull-through parking designs within those places. Rutland is an example of that, where we had awarded for more than 4 charging stations, going up to 6, and looking at having parking configurations that would support a different kind of travel. In the green, that's really just the sort of standard location where we would seek to meet the minimum number of chargers under the NEVI program. So these are all the original 15 locations that we had identified. The only one that is built out at this point right now is Bradford.
So even though, okay, I believe there's a level 3 charger in Randolph,
Yeah, so
but that
yeah.
green does not identify that charger?
Right. So just to
Okay.
clarify, Bradford is not the only charger in the state. This is just the locations where we had identified for these particular funds. There are other fast chargers in Bradford itself. If you go over to the Shaws, I think there's a number of chargers there. There are still in these locations in South Burlington, in St. Albans, in Manchester, GMP just installed for 150 kilowatt fast chargers, but they're not necessarily all up to these minimum standards. So what we're proposing to do is deploy this NEVI, the federal funds, to get those chargers that go beyond what some of these other sites might already have.
Okay, and are you currently soliciting the private sector to partner to provide that 20% match to the federal 80% funds? Or have you already found those partners?
So we already identified those partners through an RFQ last summer, and we had a solicitation to that group shortly after, and have awarded 11 of those locations.
Okay,
Yep.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Yep, sure, no problem. It was a good question.
Representative McCoy?
So the chargers in Rutland, these are on, in addition to the Tesla charging station. I mean, there must be 12 of them, the Stewart's in Rutland.
Right, so there's private investment continuing to happen in charging infrastructure throughout the state. This would be Tesla infrastructure is in a sort of pivotal moment here where some of it is available to the public, some of it's not, some of it will be, but some of it will remain within that proprietary network. And so our focus has been on making sure that the vast majority of vehicles will be able to use these sites. So the Tesla's vehicles can still use all of the sites that we're building, but not necessarily the other way around.
So where are these 9 high availability fast chargers going to be in Rutland?
So the specific location has not been identified. We're under we have an award there, but there's the contracts allow for a 60-day period to reach a site host agreement.
Okay.
And then it's based off of, that's another thing that's unique to this program where, you might not have that specific site nailed down until after the contract has been reached. So there's a 60-day period for them to submit a site host agreement, and then it's based off of that location that we then review for NEPA permitting and for, and there's a NEPA review and then right-of-way certification.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Representative Corcoran?
Patrick, can you remind me of because with the 20%, private mass, can you remind me how the fee structure, the charging structure works? Is there a cap, or they have to work in a certain parameter with the feds, or can they just charge what they want at those charging stations?
So they have to, as part of our solicitation process, they have to propose what the amount is that they would charge per kilowatt hour at a given location. There are a lot of standards around how that pricing needs to be displayed and be transparent and accessible through language and other means. So there's a lot of standards around that, and in particular through our contracts. The vendor then has to come back to us if they want to change that pricing. So there's built-in accountability that the private sector funded and owned doesn't necessarily have.
So it won't be like gas where, one day it's 20 cents more and the next day it's, 20 cents cheaper. So you wouldn't have that fluctuation. So,
Right, yeah.
all right, thanks.
So as Andrea mentioned, we had a EV charging report that was submitted on the 15th. This and that sort of requires us to identify where there are gaps. This is a heat map that attempts to do that, so it's easier to see visually. Here you can see most of the state, with the exception of sort of the northeast eastern slice there. Most of the state is within 25 miles. This is existing charging within 25 miles of a fast charger. And then the size of the circles here indicates how much charging is there. So you can see with the smaller dots, that might be just, a single charger, whereas in other areas, you're going to have Bennington as an example down there, where there's a higher number of chargers at a given location. This is taking that same analysis and then adding into it recently contracted sites under the Commerce and Community Development's Charge Vermont program, and then under our NEVI program, where we're planning to put charging in the very near future. So it gives you a sense. You got to kind of, it's a little hard with the change of color, but it gives you an idea that we're getting down from the 25-mile distance from charging infrastructure to a lot of places on the interstates and state highway network that would be more like 10 miles away. And then this was the last part of the analysis requested through the report, looking at how much charging would we need if we were to meet our climate goals. And we didn't kind of look out to 2025 because here we are, but we looked out to 2030, which is where we expect to have a much steeper increase in the amount of vehicles on the road, 126,000 plug-in electric vehicles. Now, not all of those are going to be fully electric vehicles that would rely on the network much more than just a plug-in hybrid, but 126,000 vehicles is significant. And so a couple of key assumptions. We used a tool, the link is below, through the Alternative Fuel Data Center, which allows you to sort of put in your goals for the state and be able to finely tune it for what our specific concerns are. Access to home charging is a key piece of this. If you don't have universal access to home charging, that dramatically increases the number of fast chargers, level 2s, all of the public charging that you would need to support electrification towards that 126,000 goal. So fast charging is expensive. It's expensive, as I said, to install. It's expensive to maintain, and it is expensive to consume for the average driver. So the more that we can provide access to home charging at more cost-effective investments and allowing people to access cheaper charging, the better off we'll be. Right now, we're assuming that about 71% of the state has access to home charging, and that's just looking at rental levels and multi-unit dwellings and single-family ownership. So that's just a proxy for what we might expect. The default in this tool was 87%, and that's based on the thinking that initial adopters of electric vehicle technology have been with greater means, and so are more likely to have access to home charging. In the state of Vermont, that might not necessarily be true because of all the incentive programs that we've had since the inception of those. Over 40% of folks purchasing electric vehicles have been through these programs, which are income sensitive. So we feel like a more representative assumption here is the 71%. But still, in either case, shows that we do have a gap that needs to be met in order to provide the amount of public charging needed for 126,000 vehicles. But it's also important to note that the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure was intended as a down payment, a public investment that would allow us to build out a national network that's convenient, that doesn't leave behind any part of the country, that gets as much into rural areas as urban areas, and provides that access and the convenience, the confidence that people need to be able to get around. And that once we reach some sort of critical point where the private sector has moved beyond that initial group of adopters into the mainstream, that we would then see significant private sector investment, like some of the things that you all have referenced earlier in Rutland and Bennington and elsewhere, that more of that would continue to happen because there would be a built-in demand for it, that we'd have enough EV drivers here that the private sector would follow and say, we need also to invest and go beyond just the state or NEVI programs. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're looking at, here are our gaps over the next 5 years to be able to meet our targets. Just to keep in mind that it's not necessarily that the public sector has to fill all of those. We surely have to do more, and that's what our group has been working on. But we expect that the private sector contributes as well. This is pulling that same analysis for what would support our current levels of EV adoption here in Vermont. And so right now we're sort of above where we would need to be. We recognize that not every part of the state has the same amount of coverage, and that the existence of a charger itself doesn't mean that it's serving the public necessarily, that people can come to a location and it's not working or it's being used. And so that is another focus of these investments that we have through our agency is to build out greater redundancy and provide a better experience that meets the minimum requirements that are included in all of our contracts. So as we talked about earlier, there is the NEVI funds, and they have to be spent on alternative fuel corridors. We have about $8.5 million available to us. That, if we can talk briefly about that, that is temporarily paused based on some of the confusion created by the new administration. And then we have our carbon reduction program funds that we intended to use in this next solicitation to be able to build off corridor to reach some of the places that aren't on designated alternative fuel corridors, that some of the east-west routes in the center of the state, so that we're, building out equitably as well. That's the gist of our work so far. So happy to take questions, but I know there's another presentation on deck here.
Representative Wood?
Thank you, Patrick. I have two questions. One is, has there been discussion in your agency regarding signage for EV charging? As an EV user, I find the signage fairly inadequate. And a sign that says EV charging when you're on the highway does not designate whether it's a level 2 or level 3. And as we, if you're on a trip, you want a level 3 versus a level 2. So is there any discussion about upgrading the signage to be more specific regarding what kind of charging is available?
Yeah, so in all of our contracts, we require the vendors to be able to pay for those signs that you see on the highway. I don't know that there's, I'd have to get back to you on the what the sign can denote. I know that's sort of our sign group. There's this specific set of regulations that we have to follow, the MUTCD sign regulations, and so that's a good question. I think it is important to visually have those signs from the highway and elsewhere to be able to both direct people towards where the charging is, but also to kind of give the sense to the traveling public that maybe isn't in an EV that there is an increasing amount of public charging out there. I do think that a lot of people who own or drive EVs are using sort of apps, navigation within their vehicles to find the charging, which is again more of an accurate kind of way to figure out, because some of the apps will tell you whether the charging is being used or not, or you might get an indication of whether that charger is operable at the moment. There's been recent issues with X, Y, or Z plugs. So that is more of a reliable, in real time way to have some wayfinding for actual operating charging equipment.
Yeah, I mean, I've used a lot of those apps, and again, there are just there are holes in those, and so I don't think it would be a big change, but I don't know, as a consumer, seeing an EV sign with a 2 or a 3 on it, I think it's just like one addition, but I think it would be really helpful information to the consumer. And my other question was, knowing that when people are driving level 3, when they're looking for a level 3 charger, and we know that they're going to stop and charge for about half an hour, it does bring, it's kind of like an economic opportunity. So I think about like Williston and all those shops there and all that parking. Is that an area that has been designated for a level 3 charging? So I think, number one, it's right off the highway. Number two, it would just kind of bring people into those shops and bring business to those shops while they're charging.
Yeah, so Williston was on one of our grant applications for the CFI funds, the charging and fueling infrastructure funds that would sort of start to go in between those 50-mile distances and have you know, more along the corridor there in 89. We had planned all in that area, Burlington, Winooski, Williston. So it's, you know, we have only so many funds within the NEVI program. And our first priority was to get it built out and kind of have equitable coverage across the state. But then if we do have the ability to move beyond that, we are certainly looking to locate in individual locations that are between those areas and further filling in the gaps across the state.
Real quickly, the floor put us behind and we're a little more behind, but we'll present Bert.
I can ask you this another time, Patrick. I just wanted to understand, you know, the whole amount that we had, what we've spent, what's in jeopardy, et cetera. But I can write that to you and get back because
And I think that's important for what we're trying to understand. If we're going from 17,000 vehicles to 126,000 vehicles in 5 years, and we're still talking about building one at a time, that's what I see. I you know, a dozen here or whatever, but that seemed like 1,000 seems like an awfully big gap, and I don't know what the private sector is going to pick up or not. But that's only less than 5 years now. We're talking.
so we just need a little bit.
We're gonna have to dig into this a little bit more, but that seems like a huge gap, and I'm not sure what the answers are, but I don't know how we're gonna get from 17,000 to 126,000 cars in 4 more model years either. So I guess we're gonna have to come back to it. And I apologize to the witnesses and to Andrea and Patrick. We know we're gonna have to come back to you again at some point, and my apologies, but I appreciate the presentation. Did you have one last comment there?
Sure. So there is information in the report that was submitted on the 15th. I would say, so it's 15 locations doesn't mean 15 ports. There's a minimum of 4 ports there, but the plans are in some cases for many more than that. And so the gap that you're looking at is on one of the slides. It shows 201 from now until 5 years out. So it's just to give you an idea, you know, 11 locations under award over this past solicitation, 62 ports came out of that.
Okay. Thank you very much.
We're happy to follow up with additional information.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And we will see you again. Have a nice weekend. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice weekend.
My apologies to our next set of guests. I'm not sure what order or how you're going to handle it, Allison, with our guests, but Sullivan is down there in the corner. I don't know if you're up first or you want to introduce everybody. We're
Want me to sit here or?
one of my favorite things to look forward to is the Vermont Rail
All right.
a calendar every year. We have the spectacular photography that's in there and
calendars and maps.
All right. So,
and tremendous hosts at different events. So please, welcome.
okay, thank you. So folks, I haven't been before. Selwyn Houghton, President, Vermont Rail System. I have Peter Young here as well, General Counsel, Vermont Rail System, and Mary Ann Michaels, CFO, Executive Vice President. Alice.
And I'm Alice Crowley, representing Vermont Rail. The Railroad Association of Vermont is a member here in the State House. Thank you for having us.
You'd just like me to do just a general overview or questions or?
Well, I think we should start. We have at least five new members. And so we certainly should really start with a big overview and we'll go from there.
All right, so just introduce myself again as Selwyn Houghton, President, Vermont Rail System. I actually grew up in Vermont, out in the Essex area. I've been with Vermont Rail System for 25 years now. Pretty much have done all the jobs from engineer, conductor out on the tracks up to what I do today. And I still do that stuff at times. So I very much enjoy what we do here. So basically Vermont Rail System.
Well, maybe we should introduce where we're from so you'll know who you're talking to.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Representative Walker from Swanton and Sheldon is my district.
Tim Corcoran from Bennington.
I'm Kate Lally from Shelburne. Molly Burke, Brattleboro.
Chloe Tomlinson from Winooski.
Madison Rutland one, Jim Casey.
Patty McCoy, Pulteney, Ira, and Wells.
Chris Keiser, Rutland City.
Candace White, Waitsfield.
Ken Wells, Orleans 3.
And Phil Pouch, Heinsberg.
Great. I'll read everyone. So, yeah, so basically Vermont Rail System, we operate about 450 miles of railroad. Bulk of it's in the state of Vermont. The Vermont Railway goes from Burlington to Rutland, down to North Bennington, out to Hoosick, New York. The Clarendon Pittsford Railroad is from Whitehall, New York to Rutland. And the Green Mountain Railroad goes from Rutland down to Bellows Falls. And then we have what we call the Connecticut River Line, the Washington County Railroad, that goes from Newport down to White River Junction. And in the last year, we acquired the rights to operate our trains on the New England Central between White River and Bellows Falls, which connects the Washington County Railroad with the rest of the Vermont rail system that's centralized out of Rutland. We also have a small railroad in upstate New York. We operate from Ogdensburg to Norwood, and New Hampshire Central Railroad is a recent acquisition last year. That's Colebrook, New Hampshire down to North Stratford, and Groveton down to Whitefield, New Hampshire out to Gilman, Vermont. So that's the territory we operate on. We handle about 25,000 carloads of freight a year. We also support the Amtrak Ethan Allen service down to New York City. We host the train from Burlington to Rutland over to Whitehall, New York. So there's that we do. That's generally where we operate in the state. We employ about 160 employees, the bulk of which are Vermonters. So that's kind of a general overview of the system. I think some of the biggest things we've seen in the year, and I would want to mention here, is some of the grant projects that VTrans works on. We have a great relationship with VTrans and certainly supportive of what they do just, for the whole infrastructure that's owned, the rail infrastructure owned by the state of Vermont. Certainly the grants that they work on are very important for allowing us to continue to grow and stay competitive. An important one was just completed this year between Rutland and Hoosick Junction, New York, on bridges, and getting all the bridges in the state so they can handle 286,000-pound rail cars. That's kind of the new modern standard. The older standard was 263,000-pound rail cars. So, that's really important. I would say half of the lines we operate are capable of that now. The line from Burlington to Rutland over to Whitehall is 286K. Capable, and now the line from Rutland down to Hoosick, the bridges are capable of that. I know VTrans had looked at a grant to get welded rail on that section of the railroad. I don't believe it was awarded, but certainly supporting that application going back in, and the match requirements are pretty important. And that line also, looking at that grant was to put welded rail on that railroad. Also would support, potentially any future Amtrak stuff as well on that corridor. So definitely something I probably VTrans has mentioned, and we're very supportive as well. So the Green Mountain Railroad from Rutland down to Bellows Falls, and the Washington County Railroad from Newport down to White River are not 286K capable. And we're seeing an issue today specifically on the Washington County Railroad, where we have a fairly good growth opportunity that needs that 286,000-pound capacity. So right now we're trying to look at what can be done there. So that's one thing when we look at growth, supporting those grant applications and supporting VTrans is probably a really important thing. And that would be probably my biggest thing on some of the grant stuff and the stuff we do with VTrans. So I think with that is probably my general overview. And if you folks, I'm sure, have some questions, I'd love to answer them.
Representative Pouch.
Yeah, thanks for coming in. And maybe you could just sort of step back and, we talk about the state owns some of these lines, and then you guys are using them, and maybe how it seems like a great partnership, but how the financing, goes between, what the state's responsible for, or what the state goals are, and then how Vermont Rail System sort of fits into that, and sort of a marriage, I guess,
Sure, no, great question. So the majority of lines we operate on are owned by the state of Vermont. The line from Whitehall, New York to Rutland is privately owned by Vermont Rail System. The rest of the lines in Vermont are owned by the state of Vermont. And we have an operating lease agreement, basically where we handle the operation of the railroad. We handle, some of the basic maintenance on the tracks. And the state, basically the tracks down, the infrastructure, that's more the state of Vermont. So we talk about the bridges, things of that nature, any significant capital upgrades to support Amtrak service, for example. That's where a lot of the federal grants have come in that V-Trans has applied for. So that kind of work can be done. But we handle the operation of the railroad. We handle the marketing of service. We interact with the customers. We're the ones trying to grow the freight business and put freight on the state-owned railroads, which of course is beneficial because a percentage of that revenue, of course, then goes to the state of Vermont. So, and each one has its own individual different contract without getting into some of those nuances.
Right, but so you don't pay the state like per pound or anything like that. You just have to maintain so the daily maintenance kind of oversight.
And the state's paid based on the revenue we get from the traffic. So the more traffic we get, the more it's the state gets. So is that when I talk about the 286,000 pound and all that, if we're able to continue to grow business and be competitive, that's advantageous to the state because we're going to, maintain and put more business on the railroad, hopefully get more business off of trucks. One rail car is 3.5 truckloads. And so as long as we can be competitive and keep the rail lines competitive in the state, that's advantageous to all of us.
Are there times when you're pointing like something needs to be done, something breaks or a flood or, and is it pretty clear? The state comes in and says, hey, this is our railroad, we own it, we have to fix this, or something else comes up and you go, no, that's part of, the daily maintenance, I guess.
So we have a great working relationship with V-Trans. I think we all are pretty aware of who has each responsibility in the contracts. The flooding is a perfect example. The state comes in, they know that they're going to work with FEMA public infrastructure. And we work with V-Trans to get the railroads back in service, or the bridges, for example, where the state would have the responsibility for the structure of the bridge. And, we take care of the track on top. That's pretty clear, and why the state, put that application in for those grant projects south of Rutland to get those bridges to 286. And, very important thing. And I know they're looking to do that on the other lines as well, so we can keep them competitive.
Thank you.
I guess I'll just sort of feed off that line of questioning there. I think over the summer, V-Trans is the build grant. And you had to reroute your traffic there for, I don't know, well, maybe a month or so. Can you say like the process of that? Was there any hiccups and what went into that and how smooth did it go?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is where our relationships with railroads in the surrounding area come into play. So that traffic that would normally have come in at Hoosick Junction went over to Bellows Falls. And we actually used the Pan Am Southern that's operated by the Berkshire and Eastern now, which is G&W, to basically take our traffic from Hoosick and instead bring it over to Bellows Falls. And those relationships, I might have talked several years ago when the Hoosick Tunnel had an issue on the Pan Am Southern. And basically the Vermont RailNet system supported all the traffic coming out of Eastern Massachusetts. We brought it up to Rutland, back down to Hoosick so it could get over to Albany. And we were able to keep the Pan Am Southern going. And that was basically reciprocating that favor, from that relationship. Hey, we know you need to do this work on the railroad. We'll handle getting this traffic over to Bellows Falls for you. So we have a great working relationship with them. And that's one of the areas where it certainly paid off. And it went very smooth, very flexible. Everything went well. We were able to support the work windows needed for that build grant project.
Just a quick question. So are you just focused on freight or also passenger?
So our primary focus is on freight, but we have our own passenger operations as well, and we host the Amtrak service. So I'll speak to each of those. So yes, freight is primarily where we're making the money, right? And we're getting trucks off the road. That's our majority of our focus. But Amtrak and hosting that service is also, we look at them as a major customer too. I mean, our job is to make sure that train is supported and on time. So, that's what we definitely support that service. We're out there every day inspecting tracks and doing what we need to. So that's the speeds stay consistent for Amtrak and they stay on schedule. And then we have our own seasonal tourist trains we do, primarily out of Burlington. It's a dinner train. So we do that during the summer over the weekends and then several more days in the fall. We also, in conjunction with Amtrak, we have private cars. American Association of Private Railcar Owners has been coming to Vermont now, I'm going to say 7 years. And these are basically hotels that are in rail cars. People privately own these cars and they sell them out to people all over the world for tourism. So they come up in the fall. We've had anywhere from 8 to 13 of them. They've been up in Burlington, and recently we've been bringing them up to Orleans in that area. They've been overnighting in Orleans, going to JP, going to Newport. And they're looking to grow that. They're looking to do more in Vermont, looking to market this stuff more in Vermont. So that's been a positive thing in the last few years, which is pretty neat. So we do have a little bit of passenger stuff as well that we do.
But passenger isn't where the money is. It sounds like the freight is where the
The
money
freight is, the freight is the bulk of it, getting the trucks off the road, getting it on the rail. Yep.
Just to add, and you do have your special legislative sorry, that we've had over the years, some really very nice trips down the line in old trains.
Yeah, and we certainly extend the invitation to do a trip at any time, anywhere on the system where we enjoy doing it, and we'd love to get out and do them if folks would like to do that. So
Thank you.
absolutely.
It's been a great little field trip for us.
Yeah, I assume you're the folks who are dispatching, like somebody wants to come, you say, here's when you can be on that line and monitor that safety and all that. And then if I did have a private car, maybe it's a new goal of mine, just talking about it. Would I then pay you? Like, I want to come to Burlington, is there like a fee to come and park and?
So basically, getting the traffic on the railroads, it's a great question. So, when you say dispatching the railroad, that's us operating it. So we operate and manage all the trains on the lines that we control, okay? So getting traffic on it, somebody who wants to move a freight car reaches out to our commercial folks. We provide a rate, and that moves in regular freight trains that operate every day. On a passenger train, a private car, basically, it operates on an Amtrak train. So if somebody has a private car, they work with Amtrak, and Amtrak puts it in their train. And then when it gets to us, then we take it over off the Amtrak train, then it's private agreements with us based on what the party wants to do. If they want to go to Orleans, okay, we'll bring the car into Burlington, take it off Amtrak, and then we'll bring you up to Orleans. And we work out a private deal there. But, excellent question.
Representative Feeny? Can you talk about your intermodal facilities?
So that's another great question, a little bit of history there. We used to have a lot of intermodal trailers at one time, over 6,000 of them. And we got out of that business in about 2010. And it happened with deregulation in the 80s. So initially when the intermodal first started, you could only truck a certain mile outside of a rail terminal. And that was deregulated to where you could truck any distance out of a rail terminal. So what we're competing with an intermodal terminal in Albany, in Springfield, in Worcester, in Ayer, in Montreal. And for us to bring it in, trailers or containers on the train is not competitive. You need to have at least several hundred lifts a day to support the equipment needed. So a lot of that business is coming into those terminals and being trucked into Vermont. But that being said, probably if there is intermodal potential, is probably on the Connecticut River line from Newport down to White River, down to Bellows Falls. And Montreal Intermodal Terminal has chronically had capacity issues. So if we were to able to put that stuff on a train, potentially north of the border somewhere, in conjunction with another railroad, we could bring it down into southern New England. That has potential. We've been looking at that, but that probably takes some development work. Definitely a great question. We're always looking at it, for sure.
Oh, wow.
Yes, hi. So, represent Shelburne, and we have a lot of trucks that go through our village. Could this potentially, if you were to, we're the north-south route right now, alleviate some of the truck traffic eventually?
So certainly, yeah. So, one rail car is about 3.5 truckloads. So the first thing we try to do is get it in a rail car and get it to a transload facility, whether it be Riverside or the facility in Shelburne or a facility we have up in Barton as well. Looking at what's going in the trucks, we have to look at the commodity and can it be put in a rail container? And then the infrastructure needs to be added to take that container off a train and put it on a chassis. And you have to have a pool of chassis available, and you have to have a pool of trucks available to get it to the final destination. So the first thing would be, can we get this into a rail car and just transload it to a truck once it gets here? If it can't be, we'd look at the volume, how much is it, and could it support the equipment needed to put it in a container on a train and take it off somewhere? But probably some of that stuff you're seeing is coming out of the Albany area that came in on a train to Albany and being trucked into Vermont.
Yeah.
So along that lines, targets in Vermont, they're, I don't know if it's a target-rich environment of potential. How does the rail grow in Vermont, or does it in terms of, or is it a status flat line? So where are these targets? What do they look like? How do you go after them? I guess, how does the railroad grow?
Sure. No, great question.
How do we get more trucks off? How do you look to, what does your marketing plan look like?
So we have a team of probably 5 people that are constantly looking at this stuff. I'll use an example here, right here, Montpelier Barrie, right? This railroad probably 10 years ago was only a couple cars, maybe a month. We're doing about 800 cars a year on this railroad right now, taking the granite tailings that are up on the hill in Barrie, and they're going out to the Great Lakes for breakwater projects. And that's a growing business. So certainly some growth potential here to increase those car loads. Getting the lines so there are 286K capable, the 286,000 pound rail cars is definitely a growth thing. So one of the areas we're targeting to grow now is the line that goes from Newport down to White River. There's definitely growth potential there. That's why I was talking about the 286 on that line. We do have a transload facility in Barton. We're looking to grow that, and there has been some new customers looking at that facility. One of the other opportunities we have is, I mentioned the New Hampshire Central Railroad that we took over the operation of that last year. That line, we would like to ultimately get connected back to St. Johnsbury again, which would allow for some traffic growth on the Connecticut River line, getting some business out of northern New Hampshire. That's something we're looking at. But I think some of the biggest opportunities are our transload facilities and being able to get trucks to come to a rail facility and put the product on rail cars. So definitely those are areas we're looking to grow. But aggregates is one area that we're looking to grow in.
Can I just ask, what is that called again?
Transload.
Transload, okay.
Does that answer the question?
I'd love to hear more specifics, but that's probably a little proprietary in that area. So it just seems like the rails are limited amount of locations. There's limited amount of businesses, and you got to get to and from them. So how do you do that? And how do we help maybe your existing customers grow? That would then thus drive more activity.
So certainly supporting the property along the rail corridors for rail growth is one big thing. Any properties that the state owns, making sure that we retain those for customers on those sites. There's a lot of property along the corridor that, other than just the railroad and tracks themselves, where old rail facilities used to be, it's state-owned land, maintaining that. So when we have a customer reaches out, we can say, hey, here are the locations we can site you on the railroad if they want to build a facility with a siding to put rail cars in. And we've certainly done that with multiple facilities. East Dorset, we just did one with wood pallets, where it was an old track, used to be a station there. We're bringing wood pallets in there now. That was some growth down on the B&R line south of Rutland. So that's one big way that we can do it. And also the railroad, we always look at property if it comes available that's along the corridor that the railroad will purchase. And we can help customers develop facilities there, or we can develop a transload facility there. So that's one of the big ways that we can continue to grow and bring in new businesses. And we absolutely probably have an example of that every year, at least some new customer that we brought online using one of those methods. So it definitely isn't status quo, that's for sure. And certainly the Northeast Kingdom, the Connecticut River line, we're seeing some good opportunities for growth potential there, and some other things we're working on with some of our partnering railroads as well that can be pretty big.
I would personally find it very helpful if there was a map of those state-owned assets.
I will circulate a few of these around. These are our new system maps.
As if you were queued.
Yeah. But you can keep all of these, a few of them. Yeah. So we just got these printed in October. So these are the latest and greatest.
Lots more. Here.
Yeah.
Here, I got one.
Oh, all right.
So basically, these show all the lines that we operate on or have operating rights on. And there's a little card in there that basically we can move a ton of product, about 479 miles on a gallon of fuel. So the railroad's pretty fuel efficient way of doing things. Yeah.
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 Wow.
That's an awful lot of money.
Yeah.
Starting there.
Yeah, so that's the map of the system. This is what we show our customers. So this is one of our main marketing tools. So all of our commercial folks, when they're out and about, this is what we go over with customers, and we talk about how we can locate business on the railroad. We have another great example down in right outside of North Bennington, a customer that's actually trucking out of the Albany area, putting product on rail cars in North Bennington to ship out on us, just given how we handle customer service and what we do. And that was purely because of the reputation we had that they brought that business over here. But they had to truck, and it was more, made sense for them to do that.
So just building on what Representative Lally was saying, I love the idea of taking trucks off the roads and putting, and pushing them to rail. In terms of how you're marketing, are you all chasing down trucks and cold calling them and soliciting them, or is there pressure we can put on them to push to rail?
So that's a great question. We absolutely, our commercial folks are looking at truck traffic. They'll look at, they're seeing a truck on the interstate as they're driving. Where's that truck going? And they'll kind of take a peek sometimes. Oh, they're going, oh, what are they doing? Look at all the trucks going to this facility. And then, we'll approach them and how are you getting your product? And, Billy, you say, we're trucking out of here. Well, gosh, there's a rail siding down there. We could look at rail. We start introducing that. And we say, let's get a rate together and see if that can compete with the trucks. And that's how we do it. That's a part of it. Word of mouth as well. If people say, hey, these folks are having capacity challenges with trucking or something, we'll hear it that way. But it's a lot of word of mouth and kind of seeing things. And our commercial folks are very in tune with what's going on in the industry and what's going on with various commodities in the whole Northeast. So they have a good idea of a lot of the logistical patterns and where the things are we can target. And we want to look at stuff that's high volume, right? High volume on a rail car, because each rail car is about 3.5 truckloads. So, any small stuff is tough, but when you look at bulk commodities, that's what we want to look at, target for rail, where you have, 5, 6, 7 trucks a day going somewhere. We can look at that on rail.
On the same topic, one thing I do see on the highways all the time are logs heading up to Quebec. And I just, wonder, is that just a tough one to crack, or?
It's a great question. It's one of the growth opportunities on the Connecticut River line. In fact, we're very close to probably getting some of that on rail right now. Yeah, but that's one of the things we're looking at for the Connecticut River line. And if we're able to get the Connecticut River line at St. J connected again in northern New Hampshire, that's a huge opportunity. So yes, absolutely.
Because I assume all that those trees are all going to Quebec.
And there's inbound stuff coming in for processing in New Hampshire to turn into lumber. There's both ways. So on the Washington County Railroad and the St. Johnsbury area, that's one of the things we're working on.
It's a new thing this year. Does anybody else have any other questions? We really appreciate you coming in. Apologize for the delay in getting you started and, put us back on schedule, I guess. And Allison, thank you very much for arranging.
We appreciate you having us, and certainly welcome anytime you guys want to come out and do a trip and stuff again. And I'll leave some calendars here and certainly I don't know where you're looking to go, but leave them up here. There's more of them if you need more.
I made sure, it's one of those things I make sure to get as quickly as possible.
All right.
Favorites.
If you run out, let us know. We got more in the Burlington.
You got one, yeah.
Found out last week too, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We've got a few minutes.
It used to come out.
It's crazy.
Remarkable.
Yeah, we'll do it. New York.
They better. Why don't we go ahead and adjourn for 10 minutes and we'll come back online at 11:30. Okay, thank you.